People rarely reveal who they truly are when life is easy. They reveal themselves when they believe you no longer have anything they need. My name is Harold Bennett, and on the morning of my 70th birthday, I believed I was one of the luckiest fathers in Tennessee. My daughter Linda had insisted on organizing a family birthday party at my house. My son Mark promised he would bring everyone together, including relatives I had not seen in months. Even my daughter-in-law Emily volunteered to decorate the dining room herself. After losing my wife, Margaret, 5 years earlier, family gatherings had become increasingly rare, so I genuinely looked forward to spending the evening surrounded by the people I loved most. I woke before sunrise, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and stood quietly on the back porch watching the neighborhood come alive. The air felt cool, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the yard Margaret had once cared for so faithfully. Looking across the garden, I smiled as I remembered the birthdays we celebrated together. She always said that growing older was not about counting years. It was about counting the people who still wanted to spend those years beside you. I carried those words with me as I prepared the house. Although Linda insisted I should not lift a finger, I still arranged extra chairs on the patio, polished the dining table, and placed fresh flowers in the living room. Around noon my children began arriving. At first everything seemed perfectly normal. Cars filled the driveway. Laughter echoed through the front yard. Neighbors waved as guests carried covered dishes inside. I hugged everyone warmly and thanked them for making the trip. Yet as the afternoon unfolded, I noticed small moments that felt strangely different. Conversation stopped whenever I entered a room. My children exchanged quiet glances I could not quite understand. Emily whispered something to Linda before both of them laughed softly while looking in my direction. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, birthdays were supposed to be joyful occasions. Once everyone gathered around the dining table, Mark stood to offer a toast. I expected a few heartfelt words about family or old memories. Instead, he smiled awkwardly and joked that reaching 70 meant it was finally time for me to stop pretending I could still manage such a large house alone. Several people laughed politely. Before I could respond, Emily added that maybe next year's celebration should be held somewhere smaller because maintaining this place must be exhausting for someone my age. Again, laughter filled the room. I forced a smile even though something inside me quietly tightened. Throughout dinner the jokes continued. Someone asked whether I had figured out which nursing community offered the best discounts. Another relative laughed that I probably spent more time talking to my tomato plants than to real people. None of the comments sounded cruel by themselves, yet together they slowly transformed the evening into something I no longer recognized. I looked around the table at faces I had loved my entire life and wondered why every joke seemed to begin with the assumption that my best days had already passed. As dessert was served, I reached for my glass of iced tea and quietly reminded myself that sometimes the greatest gift a parent could offer was patience. I had no desire to argue on my birthday. I simply wanted one peaceful evening with my family. I had no idea that before the night was over, every person sitting around that table would discover just how wrong they had been about the quiet old man they believed they already understood. I tried convincing myself that the awkward comments would end once everyone settled into conversation, but the atmosphere continued changing in ways I could not ignore. After dinner, Linda suggested opening presents in the living room. She smiled brightly while arranging the gifts on the coffee table, yet her expression felt strangely rehearsed. Most of the boxes contained practical items rather than personal ones. A blanket. A pill organizer. A pair of comfortable slippers. A catalogue for retirement communities with several pages folded at the corners. Everyone laughed again when Mark joked that they were simply helping me prepare for the next chapter. I smiled politely because I refused to let disappointment ruin what remained of the evening. Years of raising children had taught me that reacting in anger rarely produced wisdom. Still, every passing minute made me feel less like the guest of honor and more like an aging problem everyone hoped to solve. Emily walked around the room carrying her phone, taking photographs of the decorations, the cake, and the family gathered together. When she stopped beside me, she casually remarked that it was fortunate I had accepted getting older so gracefully because many people struggled after retirement. Before I could answer, she added that large houses often became unnecessary expenses for widowers and suggested I should probably think about selling before maintenance became impossible. Several relatives nodded in agreement as though the decision had already been made. I quietly looked around the room that Margaret and I had built together nearly 40 years earlier. Every wall held memories. Every piece of furniture carried stories of birthdays, Christmas mornings, and ordinary evenings that somehow became extraordinary simply because our family shared them together. To everyone else it seemed like valuable real estate. To me it remained home. Mark noticed my silence and attempted another joke, saying that if I ever decided to downsize, he would gladly help remove the burden by finding a buyer. Laughter followed once more, but this time it sounded different. It no longer felt playful. It sounded hopeful. That single realization settled heavily inside my heart. They were not simply teasing an old man about growing older. They were quietly imagining life after I no longer lived in the house. A little later I stepped outside onto the back porch to catch my breath. The evening air felt cooler than before, and the distant sounds of conversation drifted through the open kitchen window. Standing beside Margaret's old flower garden, I remembered the promise we made years earlier. We agreed that regardless of how successful life became, our children would always learn that people mattered more than possessions. I wondered where that lesson had slowly disappeared. As I looked toward the backyard fence, my longtime neighbor George waved from across the property line after noticing the lights and parked cars. He smiled warmly and wished me a happy birthday before returning to his evening walk. That brief gesture of genuine kindness somehow meant more than everything I had experienced inside my own home. When I walked back into the living room, I overheard part of a conversation that immediately stopped me in the hallway. Linda quietly asked Mark whether he thought I had finally updated all the paperwork. Mark answered that if everything was organized properly, sorting things out later would be much easier. Emily nodded while glancing toward the hallway where she assumed I could not hear them. At that moment I understood something painful. The birthday party I believed was celebrating my life had quietly become an opportunity for others to speculate about everything I might eventually leave behind. Instead of confronting anyone, I quietly returned to the living room carrying the same calm expression I had worn all evening. Margaret often reminded me that people revealed more through ordinary conversations than they ever did during arguments. I decided to keep listening. The birthday cake sat untouched on the dining table while relatives gathered in small groups throughout the house. Some admired the family photographs hanging along the hallway. Others discussed vacations, new cars, and rising home prices. I moved slowly among them, thanking everyone for coming and accepting birthday wishes with genuine appreciation. Yet behind every smile I found myself noticing details I had ignored before. Linda repeatedly glanced toward my home office at the end of the hallway. Mark asked casual questions about property taxes, insurance policies, and maintenance costs. Emily complimented the recent kitchen renovation before quietly asking whether I had ever considered moving into a luxury retirement community where life would be much easier. Her voice remained polite, but the timing felt strangely deliberate. I answered that I still enjoyed mowing my own lawn, cooking my own meals, and sleeping in the same bedroom where Margaret and I spent nearly 40 years together. Emily responded with an understanding smile that somehow carried more disbelief than respect. A few minutes later my younger cousin Robert approached with a cup of coffee and quietly sat beside me on the porch swing. Unlike the others, he asked nothing about money or the house. Instead, he asked whether I missed Margaret as much now as I did 5 years ago. I smiled gently before admitting that grief changed over time but never completely disappeared. Robert nodded thoughtfully and told me that he admired how I continued living independently despite losing the person who had shared most of my life. His simple kindness reminded me that not everyone attending the party viewed me through the same lens. Before returning inside, he quietly squeezed my shoulder and wished me many more healthy birthdays. His sincerity gave me strength I did not realize I needed. Back inside, Linda suggested gathering everyone for another family photograph. As people arranged themselves in front of the fireplace, I noticed something peculiar. They instinctively placed me in the center, yet several conversations continued as though I were not standing there. Mark joked with Emily about finally convincing me to simplify my life. Someone laughed that old houses required younger owners with more energy. Another relative wondered aloud whether the real estate market might improve even further next spring. They spoke about my future as though my opinion had already become optional. The camera flashed several times while forced smiles filled the room. Looking around at familiar faces, I realized that many of them still loved me. Yet somewhere along the way they had quietly begun measuring my value by what I owned instead of who I had always tried to be. After the photographs, Linda carried the birthday cake into the living room. 70 candles would have been impossible, so she placed a large number 7 beside a smaller number 0 across the frosting. Everyone sang enthusiastically while I smiled and thanked them for coming. When the song ended, Mark encouraged me to make a birthday wish before blowing out the candles. I closed my eyes for only a moment. I did not wish for better health, more money, or longer life. I wished that somehow my family would remember the values Margaret and I had spent decades trying to teach them. As the candles went dark and applause filled the room, the front doorbell suddenly rang. The unexpected sound interrupted every conversation. None of us knew that the person waiting on the other side of that door was about to change the meaning of my birthday forever. The room fell completely silent after the doorbell echoed through the house. Linda glanced toward the front entrance before looking back at me with a puzzled expression. She quietly asked whether I was expecting anyone else, and I honestly answered that I was not. Mark laughed and joked that perhaps another neighbor had remembered my birthday at the last minute. Emily smoothed the tablecloth and continued arranging dessert plates while several relatives returned to casual conversation. I walked slowly toward the front door without feeling any particular urgency. Through the decorative glass beside the entrance, I could see the outline of a man wearing a dark suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. When I opened the door, he smiled politely before introducing himself as David Collins. His voice sounded calm and professional. He apologized for arriving during a family celebration but explained that he had hoped to speak with me briefly in person because he happened to be in the neighborhood after another appointment. I immediately recognized his name. David had served as Margaret's attorney for many years before gradually becoming our family's legal advisor as well. We had not spoken in several months. I warmly invited him inside, assuming he simply wanted to wish me a happy birthday or schedule a future meeting. As we entered the living room together, nearly every conversation stopped. Several relatives recognized David immediately. Linda smiled politely but appeared surprised to see him. Mark quietly whispered something to Emily, who suddenly looked much more interested in the leather briefcase David carried beneath his arm. David greeted everyone respectfully before handing me a small wrapped gift no larger than a hardcover book. Inside rested a beautifully bound edition of my favorite collection of historical essays. Margaret had once mentioned to him how much I enjoyed reading them. The thoughtful gesture touched me more deeply than many of the expensive-looking presents already stacked beside the fireplace. We thanked each other warmly before David casually asked whether he might speak with me for just a few minutes after the guests finished celebrating. His tone remained completely ordinary, yet I noticed Linda listening carefully from across the room. Before I could answer, Mark stepped forward and cheerfully suggested that since everyone was already gathered together, perhaps there was no reason for private conversations among family. David smiled politely but made no immediate reply. Instead, he accepted a slice of birthday cake after I insisted he join us for a few minutes. As people resumed eating dessert, I watched subtle changes unfold around the room. Emily repeatedly glanced toward David's briefcase. Linda asked whether business had been busy recently. Mark jokingly wondered aloud whether lawyers ever truly stopped working. David answered each question with quiet professionalism while revealing almost nothing about the reason for his visit. His calm demeanor somehow increased everyone's curiosity. I found the situation strangely amusing because he appeared completely relaxed while everyone else seemed increasingly uncomfortable. After several minutes, David placed his coffee cup on the table and stood. He thanked everyone for their hospitality before turning toward me with the same composed expression he had worn since arriving. Then he asked a single question that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room. He wanted to know whether I still wished to follow the written instructions Margaret and I had signed together several years before. I looked directly into his eyes, understood exactly what he meant, and quietly answered yes. Across the room I noticed Linda, Mark, and Emily exchange confused glances. None of them had any idea what instructions David was referring to, and for the first time that evening, the confident smiles slowly began disappearing from their faces. 4. Several long seconds no one spoke. The room remained unusually quiet as every pair of eyes shifted between David Collins and me. I could almost hear everyone trying to guess what those written instructions might involve. David never appeared rushed. He simply opened his leather briefcase, removed a neatly organized folder, and placed it gently on the dining table beside the birthday cake. He did not open it. Instead, he looked toward me with the same respectful expression he had always shown throughout the years. I thanked him for honoring Margaret's wishes so faithfully even after all this time. Hearing my late wife's name immediately changed the mood inside the room. Linda lowered her eyes for a moment while Mark quietly folded his arms across his chest. Emily remained standing beside the kitchen doorway, pretending to clear empty dessert plates while listening to every word. David explained that Margaret believed important family conversations should happen while people were together rather than through telephone calls or scattered meetings weeks apart. That was why she had left detailed written instructions regarding a specific family discussion that could only occur after my 70th birthday if I personally agreed. I smiled softly because that sounded exactly like Margaret. She always believed families should face difficult truths together instead of allowing misunderstandings to grow in silence. Mark finally broke the quiet by asking whether the conversation involved my estate planning. His question sounded casual, but I noticed how quickly several relatives stopped pretending not to listen. David answered carefully. He explained that the folder contained several legal documents connected to long-term family planning, but he would discuss them only if I requested it. He reminded everyone that the papers remained entirely confidential unless I chose otherwise. Linda immediately smiled and said there was no reason to keep secrets from family members who cared about one another. Her words sounded reasonable, yet I remembered the conversation I had overheard earlier about organizing paperwork and making things easier later. Instead of responding immediately, I looked around the room at the photographs decorating the walls. Nearly every picture represented years of birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and ordinary moments Margaret had carefully preserved. She often reminded me that documents could distribute property, but only character determined whether a family remained united afterward. I quietly asked David whether Margaret had left anything else besides legal instructions. He nodded and reached into the folder once more, removing a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in her familiar handwriting. Seeing those graceful letters stopped me completely. I had not seen Margaret's handwriting in years. Carefully opening the envelope, I unfolded several pages and silently read the first few lines. A gentle smile slowly crossed my face before I folded the letter again. Linda asked whether everything was all right. I answered honestly that everything was exactly as Margaret hoped it would be. The answer only increased everyone's curiosity. David then explained that before discussing any legal matters, Margaret specifically requested that I decide whether the conversation should remain private or include everyone gathered in the house that evening. It was entirely my decision. I looked across the room at my children, my relatives, and the birthday decorations surrounding us. Only an hour earlier I had felt invisible inside my own home. Now everyone waited for a single answer from the quiet old man they believed no longer mattered very much. After thinking carefully for several moments, I smiled gently and told David that if my family truly wished to understand the future, then perhaps it was finally time for all of us to begin by remembering the past. David Collins remained standing beside the dining table while everyone slowly returned to their seats. No one reached for another piece of cake. No one continued the casual conversations that had filled the house only minutes earlier. The atmosphere had quietly shifted from celebration to reflection. David opened the leather folder with deliberate care and removed several older documents protected inside transparent sleeves. He explained that before Margaret became ill, the two of us spent many evenings reviewing our finances, not because we expected immediate changes, but because we believed responsible planning was one final act of love parents could offer their children. Margaret often reminded me that inheritance should never become the foundation of a family's relationships. Respect had to exist long before any legal document was ever opened. As David spoke, I noticed Linda studying every page that appeared on the table. Mark leaned forward with folded arms, trying to identify familiar signatures. Emily remained unusually quiet, her confident smile from earlier completely gone. David first presented copies of business records dating back more than 30 years. They showed the small construction company Margaret and I built from a single pickup truck, 2 used ladders, and long weeks of exhausting work. I quietly smiled while remembering those difficult years. We did not become successful overnight. We sacrificed vacations, worked weekends, postponed luxuries, and often worried about making payroll before paying ourselves. Margaret managed the office while I spent long days meeting clients and supervising projects. Together we slowly built something that eventually provided opportunities for our family. David gently explained that these documents were not included because of their legal value. Margaret specifically requested that every family member see them at least once, so no one would ever forget where everything truly began. Several relatives looked surprised as they examined photographs of our first tiny office, faded invoices, handwritten budgets, and old bank loan approvals carrying balances that once seemed impossible to repay. Linda quietly admitted she had forgotten many of those years because she had been so young. Mark lowered his eyes after recognizing a photograph of himself sitting beside me at a construction site wearing an oversized safety helmet. I remember that afternoon clearly. He had proudly announced that one day he wanted to help run the family business. Looking around the room, I realized how easy it was for success to erase memories of sacrifice. David then removed another envelope labeled in Margaret's handwriting. Inside rested several letters she had written individually to each member of our immediate family years before her passing. She instructed that none of them should be opened that evening. Instead, each letter would be given privately to its intended recipient after the family discussion concluded. Emily quietly asked why Margaret had waited so long to share them. David answered that Margaret believed people often heard difficult truths differently after gaining more life experience. The room fell silent once again. No one laughed. No one interrupted. For the first time all evening, everyone seemed less interested in what property might eventually be divided and more interested in understanding the two people who had quietly spent decades creating everything they now enjoyed. I looked at Margaret's framed photograph resting above the fireplace and felt grateful that even after her passing, she still possessed the remarkable ability to bring our family together without raising her voice. Then David carefully placed one final unopened folder on the table and calmly explained that what remained inside had nothing to do with sentimental memories. It contained decisions that would shape every family's future, but before anyone saw those pages, he asked us to remember the lesson Margaret hoped we had already begun learning that evening. David rested one hand gently on the unopened folder before looking around the room. His calm expression never changed, yet everyone seemed to understand that the conversation was about to become far more serious. He explained that Margaret wanted one final opportunity to speak to her family through the decisions she and I had made together while she was still healthy. Every page inside the folder reflected months of thoughtful discussion rather than emotional reactions. Before opening it, he asked whether anyone wished to leave the room. No one moved. Linda quietly folded her hands in her lap. Mark leaned back into his chair, attempting to appear relaxed, although I could see the tension in his face. Emily placed her untouched coffee cup on the table without saying a word. David slowly opened the folder and removed the first document. Instead of reading legal language, he began with a simple statement Margaret had written herself. She explained that families often spent too much time wondering what they would someday receive and not enough time appreciating what they had already been given. She reminded our children that education, opportunities, stability, and unconditional support had always been their greatest inheritance, long before money ever entered the conversation. As David read her words aloud, I noticed several relatives quietly wiping tears from their eyes. Margaret possessed a remarkable gift for speaking honestly without making anyone feel attacked. When he finished reading, David carefully placed the handwritten statement beside the photographs from our early years. Then he revealed a timeline documenting every major financial decision we had made over the previous 35 years. There were records showing college tuition payments, down payments we had quietly provided when Linda and Mark purchased their first homes, emergency loans that were never requested to be repaid, business investments made to help relatives recover from difficult circumstances, and countless smaller acts of generosity that Margaret insisted should never be mentioned unless absolutely necessary. Looking through those pages reminded even me how many blessings had quietly flowed through our family over the decades. Linda stared silently at one page listing the funds we contributed toward her graduate education after she believed scholarships had covered everything. Mark looked equally surprised after discovering that the financial struggles during the first years of his business had been eased by private guarantees I signed without ever telling him. Emily softly whispered that she had never known any of it. I simply smiled because Margaret and I had never believed kindness required public recognition. David explained that the purpose of these records was not to create guilt or demand gratitude. Margaret wanted everyone to understand that generosity rarely announced itself. It usually happened quietly while expecting nothing in return. The room remained completely silent as people slowly absorbed that truth. Finally, Mark cleared his throat and admitted he had always assumed our financial success came easily because I rarely spoke about difficult years. I answered gently that parents often hide burdens from their children so those children can grow without carrying unnecessary worries. That choice, however, sometimes creates the mistaken impression that success appears effortlessly. David nodded in agreement before closing the timeline folder. He then rested his hand on a second set of sealed legal papers that remained untouched. His voice became slightly more formal as he explained that everything discussed so far concerned our family's history. What remained concerned its future. He reminded everyone once again that legal documents often changed ownership, but they could never create love, respect, or trust where those qualities no longer existed. With that quiet warning, he carefully broke the seal on the final envelope while every person in the room held their breath, uncertain what truths were waiting inside. David carefully unfolded the first legal document and adjusted his glasses before speaking. His voice remained steady and professional, but every person in the room seemed to understand that the next few minutes would carry consequences extending far beyond a birthday celebration. He explained that many people assumed they already understood how our estate had been organized simply because I had retired several years earlier. In reality, Margaret and I had continued reviewing our legal plans almost every year after her diagnosis, making thoughtful adjustments whenever circumstances changed. The first document confirmed that our previous family trust remained active exactly as intended. Nothing about that surprised anyone. Linda nodded quietly while Mark appeared relieved that familiar legal structures were still in place. Then David placed a second document beside the first and explained that this amendment had replaced several earlier assumptions the family might still believe were true. He emphasized that the amendment became legally effective only after my 70th birthday because Margaret specifically wanted me to enjoy complete independence throughout my retirement before any future planning officially changed. Emily leaned forward slightly while pretending to remain relaxed. Mark quietly asked whether the amendment involved the family home. David answered that the house represented only one small part of a much broader estate plan. The amendment focused less on dividing property and more on protecting long-term family stability. He then described how Margaret and I had established a private educational foundation years earlier. The foundation would provide college scholarships for future grandchildren, vocational training assistance for younger family members, and emergency educational grants for relatives facing unexpected hardship. None of the money inside that foundation could ever be withdrawn for luxury purchases, vacations, or personal lifestyles. It existed solely to expand opportunities for future generations. Several relatives exchanged surprised glances because no one had ever heard about the foundation before. Linda softly admitted that it sounded exactly like something her mother would create. David smiled gently before confirming that Margaret personally designed many of its guiding principles. Next, he revealed that another portion of our estate had already been placed inside a charitable community trust supporting skilled trade apprenticeships for young adults entering construction careers. My heart quietly warmed as I remembered the conversations Margaret and I shared while creating those plans. She always believed success carried responsibility beyond one's own family. Mark listened carefully before asking how much remained available for direct inheritance after those charitable commitments. His question sounded practical, yet I noticed the subtle disappointment that crossed Emily's face as percentages and allocations gradually shifted away from personal wealth. David politely explained that the exact values would be discussed later because several additional documents affected the final calculations. He also reminded everyone that my retirement benefits, investment income, and personal property remained entirely under my control while I was alive. Nothing changed that simple fact. Looking around the room, I realized many assumptions had already begun quietly falling apart. My children had apparently believed everything important had been settled years earlier. Instead, they were discovering that Margaret and I had continued planning carefully, always thinking beyond immediate comfort toward future purpose. David slowly gathered the completed pages into one stack before reaching for another sealed envelope hidden beneath them. He paused briefly and looked directly at me. I understood why. What remained inside that final envelope had less to do with money than with trust itself. I gave him a quiet nod, granting permission to continue. Across the table, every member of my family watched silently, unaware that the next document would challenge not only what they expected to inherit someday, but also how they had treated the man sitting quietly at the head of the birthday table all evening. David opened the final envelope with extraordinary care, almost as though he understood its contents carried far more emotional weight than legal significance. Inside rested only a few pages, yet he held them separately from every other document on the table. Before reading, he explained that Margaret insisted these instructions remain sealed until after every previous record had been discussed. She believed no one could properly understand the final decision without first remembering the sacrifices that built our family's life together. The room remained perfectly still. Even relatives who had shown only casual interest earlier now watched quietly. David began reading. The document confirmed that Margaret and I had appointed an independent advisory board to oversee every charitable foundation and educational trust after both of us were gone. Neither Linda nor Mark would automatically control those organizations simply because they were our children. Professional trustees would ensure every dollar continued serving the original purpose we intended. Linda appeared surprised but accepted the explanation with a thoughtful nod. Mark shifted slightly in his chair before asking whether the family business had also been placed under outside management. David answered that the business itself no longer belonged entirely to our family in the way many people assumed. Years before retiring, I had gradually sold ownership shares to longtime employees through an employee partnership program. Margaret fully supported the decision because we believed the people who helped build the company deserved an opportunity to share in its future. Several relatives looked genuinely astonished. Emily quietly whispered that she never realized the business structure had changed so dramatically. David smiled politely before explaining that those decisions had been public corporate records for years, although few family members had ever asked about them. I quietly remembered the evening Margaret encouraged me to begin that transition. She often said loyal employees became part of a family's legacy too. David then revealed another document showing that the family home would remain under my complete ownership for the rest of my life without exception. No relative possessed any legal authority to sell, mortgage, transfer, or influence decisions involving the property while I remained alive. Although I already knew this provision existed, I noticed several subtle reactions around the room. Mark's confident posture slowly disappeared. Emily looked toward Linda with quiet uncertainty. For the first time all evening, no one mentioned retirement communities, downsizing, or simplifying my life. David continued reading. After my passing, the home would not automatically belong to any single child. Instead, it would first be offered as a gathering place for annual family reunions through a protected family preservation agreement lasting several years before any permanent decision could be considered. Margaret wanted future generations to experience the same home where birthdays, holidays, and ordinary evenings had shaped our family's identity. Financial value, she wrote, should never erase emotional value. Her words settled gently across the room. Looking around the table, I realized that many people were no longer thinking about property. They were remembering forgotten moments from childhood hidden inside these familiar walls. David slowly lowered the final page before looking directly at me once again. He explained that only one document remained unread. Unlike every previous paper, this one had nothing to do with money, property, or legal ownership. Margaret described it simply as the most important instruction she ever left behind. She insisted that I decide whether to share it with everyone present or keep it entirely private. I looked at the faces surrounding me and quietly understood that the next few minutes might determine far more than the future of an estate. They might determine the future of our family itself. After several quiet moments, I looked at David Collins and told him that Margaret never believed important truths should remain hidden once the right moment arrived. If she wanted our family to hear her final message together, then that was exactly how it should happen. David gave a respectful nod before removing one last handwritten letter from the envelope. Unlike the earlier notes, this one was written entirely in Margaret's own hand. Even before he began reading, I recognized the careful script that had filled birthday cards, grocery lists, and countless small reminders throughout our marriage. The sight alone brought back years of ordinary happiness. David read slowly so every word could settle into the room. Margaret began by thanking each family member for sharing so many beautiful years together. She wrote that every family experiences seasons of misunderstanding, disappointment, and change, but love survives only when people choose respect before convenience. Then her message became more personal. She explained that while she was receiving medical treatment during the final months of her life, she quietly noticed something that deeply concerned her. Conversations within the family had slowly shifted away from gratitude and toward expectation. Too often people discussed what they might someday receive instead of appreciating what already surrounded them. She worried that one day Harold would become viewed less as a father and more as the keeper of future possessions. Those words landed heavily across the room. No one interrupted. No one defended themselves. Margaret continued by explaining why she insisted every legal document remain delayed until my 70th birthday. She wanted enough time to reveal people's hearts naturally rather than forcing artificial behavior created by legal consequences. If family members consistently treated one another with kindness during those years, then her concerns would have been unnecessary. If they failed, the delay itself would quietly reveal everything she needed to know. I lowered my eyes for a moment because I finally understood something Margaret had never shared with me while she was alive. She had not delayed the documents to test our children. She had delayed them to protect me from making painful decisions too early. David continued reading. Margaret reminded everyone that aging did not reduce a person's worth. Parents who became slower, quieter, or less physically capable remained deserving of the same dignity they freely gave their children throughout life. She gently warned that jokes about growing older often wounded far more deeply than people realized because they reminded someone that love might now be measured by usefulness instead of relationship. Linda quietly wiped tears from her face. Mark stared silently at the floor. Emily no longer attempted to hide her emotions. Every casual remark from earlier that evening suddenly sounded different when viewed through Margaret's words. David finished reading the final paragraph. Margaret wrote that no inheritance could ever compensate for years of withheld respect. Money divided eventually disappeared. Homes changed ownership. Businesses grew or declined. Character alone remained part of every generation that followed. She asked each family member to remember that the greatest gift children could ever give aging parents was not expensive presents or elaborate celebrations. It was making them feel valued while they were still present to receive that love. When David gently folded the letter closed, no applause followed. No conversation began. The silence filling the room carried more honesty than every joke shared earlier that evening. Looking around at my family, I realized Margaret's final birthday gift had never been intended for me alone. It had quietly become a mirror placed before every person sitting around the table. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. Margaret's final words remained suspended in the quiet living room long after David Collins carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside its envelope. The birthday candles had burned themselves into small pools of wax, untouched slices of cake rested on forgotten plates, and every decoration Linda had arranged earlier that afternoon suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the conversation now surrounding us. I slowly stood from my chair and thanked David for honoring Margaret's wishes with the same professionalism and kindness he had always shown our family. He simply nodded, understanding that his role was nearly complete. Linda was the first to break the silence. Her voice trembled as she admitted she had not realized how many of her comments throughout the evening sounded disrespectful until she heard them repeated inside her own mind through Margaret's words. She apologized for treating me more like someone who needed to be managed than the father who had spent decades supporting her dreams. Mark remained seated with his hands clasped together. When he finally spoke, he admitted something even more difficult. He confessed that over the past several years he had quietly assumed I had already finished making the important decisions about the future. Without intending to become selfish, he had gradually begun thinking of my home and finances as things that would eventually become family responsibilities rather than remembering they still belonged to the man sitting across the table. Emily lowered her eyes before softly saying that many of the jokes she made during dinner were meant to sound harmless, yet she now understood that repeated comments could slowly strip away another person's dignity even when no cruelty was intended. Hearing each of them speak honestly filled me with unexpected peace. I had never wanted anyone to feel ashamed. I only wanted my family to remember that growing older did not erase the years of sacrifice that came before. David quietly gathered the legal documents into organized folders and placed them back inside his briefcase. Before leaving, he reminded everyone that the legal plans Margaret and I created were designed to protect the family rather than divide it. Whether those documents ultimately became a source of unity or conflict depended entirely upon the character of the people carrying them forward. After wishing me a happy birthday once more, he shook my hand warmly and walked toward the front door. Every person in the room stood as he left. Once the door closed behind him, the house became quiet again. Linda walked into the kitchen without saying anything and returned a few moments later carrying fresh coffee for everyone. No one asked her to do it. She simply wanted to contribute in a different way than she had earlier. Mark quietly collected empty plates and began cleaning the dining table beside me. Emily folded the decorations she had carefully arranged only hours before, but this time she worked slowly, occasionally glancing toward Margaret's photograph above the fireplace. Watching those simple acts reminded me that genuine change rarely announced itself through dramatic speeches. More often it appeared through ordinary choices made after difficult truths were accepted. As I looked around the familiar room, I realized my birthday had not become memorable because of presents, legal papers, or unexpected visitors. It became unforgettable because my family finally stopped discussing what they might someday inherit and began rediscovering the relationships they still had the opportunity to cherish. For the first time that entire evening, the house truly felt like home again. The weeks following my birthday passed more quietly than any period I could remember in recent years. Something fundamental had shifted within our family, not because legal documents forced change, but because Margaret's words continued echoing through conversations that once revolved around entirely different priorities. Linda began visiting every Sunday afternoon without waiting for a holiday or special occasion. Instead of discussing future plans for the house or asking whether I needed to simplify my life, she often brought homemade soup, sat beside me on the back porch, and listened while I shared stories she had never taken time to hear before. We spoke about the years when her mother and I struggled to keep our young business alive, about family vacations planned on modest budgets, and about the countless ordinary moments that somehow became the memories we treasured most. More than once Linda admitted she regretted never asking those questions while Margaret was still alive. Mark also changed in ways I had not expected. One Saturday morning he surprised me by arriving with his toolbox before sunrise. Without mentioning money or property, he simply asked whether I wanted help repairing the old fence surrounding Margaret's flower garden. We spent the entire day working side by side just as we had when he was a teenager. Between replacing weathered boards and repainting the gate, we talked honestly about life, business, and fatherhood. At one point Mark quietly admitted he had spent too many years assuming there would always be another opportunity to slow down and simply spend time together. Watching him carefully straighten each fence post reminded me that sometimes people repaired relationships the same way they repaired old wood. Not by replacing everything at once, but by patiently strengthening one section after another. Emily surprised me as well. A few weeks after the birthday, she asked whether I would allow her to help organize Margaret's handwritten recipes into a family cookbook so future generations could preserve them. As we sorted through faded recipe cards and handwritten notes inside the kitchen where Margaret had cooked for decades, Emily apologized once more for the careless humor she had used during my birthday celebration. I told her something Margaret often believed. People should certainly apologize for mistakes, but they should spend even more energy living differently afterward. Emily smiled softly and promised she intended to do exactly that. As autumn slowly turned toward winter, our annual Thanksgiving gathering approached. For the first time in years, no one discussed inheritance, legal paperwork, or future ownership before arriving. Instead, family members volunteered to cook favorite recipes, decorate the dining room, and invite neighbors who otherwise would have spent the holiday alone. Standing in the kitchen watching 3 generations prepare dinner together, I quietly realized that Margaret's final letter continued accomplishing what no legal contract ever could. It reminded people why families existed in the first place. Later that evening, after everyone left, I walked through the quiet house before stopping beneath Margaret's framed photograph above the fireplace. I smiled gently and thanked her for understanding something I had not fully recognized while she was still beside me. Sometimes the greatest protection parents can leave behind is not wealth carefully divided, but wisdom patiently planted. Years later, when circumstances finally reveal people's hearts, that wisdom quietly grows into the inheritance that matters most. Nearly 3 years passed before I fully understood how much my 70th birthday had transformed not only my family but also my own heart. Time carried us gently forward. Linda became deeply involved in the educational foundation Margaret and I created, volunteering countless hours reviewing scholarship applications and meeting young students whose dreams reminded her of the opportunities her own parents once sacrificed to provide. Mark strengthened the employee partnership program within the construction company, working closely with longtime craftsmen who had helped build the business from its earliest years. Instead of viewing the company merely as a financial asset, he gradually began treating it as a responsibility shared with people whose families depended upon its success. Emily completed the family cookbook she once proposed, carefully preserving Margaret's handwritten recipes beside short stories describing the memories connected to each meal. Every Christmas she prepared several of those dishes exactly as Margaret had done, ensuring younger relatives understood that traditions carried love from one generation into the next. Watching these quiet changes unfold brought me more happiness than any legal victory or financial achievement ever could. One spring afternoon, our educational foundation hosted its annual scholarship luncheon. Students from across Tennessee gathered to meet the donors supporting their education. Many came from families facing significant financial challenges, yet each carried extraordinary determination. During the ceremony, one young woman stood to thank the foundation for believing in people before success became visible. Her words immediately reminded me of Margaret. She often said that investing in another person's future represented one of the purest forms of hope. As the audience applauded, I quietly looked toward Linda and Mark sitting together near the front of the room. They smiled proudly, not because our family's name appeared on the scholarship program, but because they now understood why their mother insisted that wealth should always create opportunities beyond personal comfort. After the event, we returned to my house for dinner. Unlike my 70th birthday years earlier, the conversation centered on students, volunteer projects, neighborhood improvements, and family vacations. No one mentioned inheritances or legal paperwork. At one point, Emily laughed while serving dessert and admitted she still felt embarrassed remembering the jokes she made during my birthday celebration years before. I smiled warmly and reminded her that everyone eventually wished they could rewrite certain moments from the past. What mattered most was allowing those regrets to shape wiser decisions rather than lasting shame. Later that evening, Linda handed me a framed photograph taken during the scholarship ceremony. Beneath the picture, she had placed one sentence from Margaret's final letter. It read that respect should always arrive before inheritance because only one of those gifts could still be offered while someone remained alive. I carefully placed the photograph beside Margaret's portrait above the fireplace. Looking at them together, I realized something beautiful had happened almost without anyone noticing. The birthday party that once revealed our family's greatest weakness had quietly become the beginning of its strongest chapter. Margaret's wisdom continued guiding us long after her voice became a memory. Standing alone in the peaceful living room that night, surrounded by decades of family photographs, I no longer thought about the embarrassment I experienced on my 70th birthday. Instead, I felt grateful that one painful evening had gently redirected an entire family toward kindness, gratitude, and the understanding that the greatest legacy parents leave behind is not measured in dollars, deeds, or signatures, but in the character their children choose to carry into the future. On my 80th birthday, the house was full once again. The same front porch welcomed familiar footsteps. The same dining room table held homemade meals prepared from Margaret's cookbook. The same fireplace warmed the living room where our family gathered, yet everything felt remarkably different from the evening 10 years earlier. No one arrived wondering what they might someday inherit. They came because they genuinely wanted to spend time together. Linda arrived early carrying fresh flowers for Margaret's portrait before helping prepare lunch in the kitchen. Mark spent the morning repairing a loose gate in the backyard without being asked, laughing with his own children while explaining how their grandfather had built the fence decades before. Emily carefully placed framed photographs from every family gathering since my 70th birthday across a long display table so everyone could remember how much life had changed. Looking around the room, I quietly realized that the greatest transformation had not happened inside legal documents or financial plans. It had happened inside people's hearts. During the afternoon, our grandchildren asked if I would tell the story behind the old construction company photographs hanging in the hallway. As we walked from picture to picture, I explained how Margaret and I started with almost nothing except determination, honesty, and the willingness to work hard every single day. I told them success was never built by one extraordinary decision. It grew from thousands of ordinary choices made with integrity even when no one was watching. They listened with genuine curiosity, asking questions that reminded me of Linda and Mark when they were young. I silently thanked Margaret because her greatest dream had finally become reality. The next generation cared more about family values than family wealth. Later that evening, just before dessert, Linda stood and raised her glass. She smiled through grateful tears before saying that my 70th birthday had once been the most uncomfortable day our family ever experienced. At the time, none of them understood why a lawyer's unexpected visit changed everything. Looking back now, she believed that evening had become the greatest gift either parent ever left behind because it reminded everyone that love demanded respect long before it deserved gratitude. Mark quietly agreed. He admitted that whenever he faced an important business decision, he still asked himself whether it would make his parents proud instead of merely increasing profits. Emily smiled warmly before adding that every family recipe she prepared carried a memory of Margaret's wisdom and my quiet patience. Listening to them, I felt no pride in being proven right. I simply felt thankful that life had given all of us another opportunity to become better than we once were. As the celebration ended and everyone prepared to leave, my youngest granddaughter slipped a handmade birthday card into my hands. Inside she had written one simple sentence in careful handwriting. It said that she hoped people would always remember Grandpa Harold not because of the house he owned or the business he built, but because he taught our family how to treat one another. I closed the card slowly and looked toward Margaret's smiling photograph above the fireplace. At that moment I realized that every sacrifice we made, every difficult year we endured, every lesson we tried to teach, and even the painful birthday that once broke my heart had become part of something far greater than ourselves. In the end, the lawyer did not save our family with legal papers. Margaret did not change our future with money. What truly restored our family was the simple truth that dignity should never have to wait for a funeral, an inheritance, or a final goodbye. The people we love deserve our respect while they are still sitting beside us at the table, because the richest legacy any family can ever leave behind is not what they pass down after life ends, but how they choose to love one another while they still have the chance.